There are moments in history when the tide of events shifts, not because of armies or kings or empires, but because of one person, a single soul who dares to cross borders, defy expectations, and carry ideals across oceans. Marquis de Lafayette was such a soul. Born into French nobility, he had every reason to stay, to remain safe, respected, and distant from revolution. But he chose differently. At just 19 years old, driven not by profit or power, but by principle, Lafayette left behind a world of privilege to chase a vision of liberty, not for himself, but for a distant people. His destination? A struggling group of colonies across the Atlantic, a place where freedom was still a dream, fragile, unfinished, uncertain. It was there that Lafayette would forge friendships, shape history, and become a hero not of one nation, but of two. This is not just a story of war and revolution. It is a story of idealism, sacrifice, and courage in the face of the impossible. So join me, Phileas Kronos, as we set sail through time and uncover the extraordinary life of the Marquis de Lafayette, hero of two worlds. Our journey begins in the heart of France, in the quiet, mist-covered hills of Auvergne. Here, far from the palaces and courts of Paris, lies the Château de Chavagnac. It was there, on September 6, 1757, that Gilbert du Motier was born into one of France's oldest noble families. But privilege did not shield him from pain. Only a year after his birth, his father, Michel Louis Christophe Roch Gilbert du Motier, was killed in the Battle of Minden, struck down while leading a French charge against British lines. The boy would never know him, but the legacy of that sacrifice would cast a long shadow over Gilbert's life. He spent his early years not in the salons of Versailles, but among the fields and forests of rural Auvergne. At Chavagnac, he lived alongside the village peasants, rode through the countryside, and spoke with the farmers who worked his family's land. While still a noble by birth, Gilbert learned to see the world through humbler eyes, to respect the dignity of labor and the quiet wisdom of the common folk. This connection to the people, rare for someone of his station, planted the earliest seeds of a lifelong empathy. At the age of 11, he was summoned to Paris to live with his mother and her side of the family, deeply entrenched in the royal court. She hoped to mold her son into a perfect nobleman, loyal to the crown, polished in manner, and positioned for influence. But Paris was not the home he longed for. Gilbert resented the hollow rituals of courtly life. The masks, the games, the rigid etiquette, it all felt like a gilded cage. At just 16 years old, he was married to Adrienne de Noailles, the daughter of one of France's most powerful aristocratic families. The match was arranged, strategic, a union of names and fortunes designed to bind him ever closer to the heart of royal influence. And yet, something unexpected happened. What began as an obligation quietly grew into affection. In time, genuine love blossomed between Gilbert and Adrienne, a rare, quiet bond in a world of political marriages. She would become his confidant, his partner, and his anchor through the storms of revolution that lay ahead. Still, the expectations of the court pressed down upon him. At one royal masquerade, a lavish event attended by princes and ministers, Lafayette found himself face to face with the Dauphin, the future king of France. Custom demanded he remain anonymous, but in a moment that would later seem almost prophetic, Gilbert deliberately let his mask fall. Whether by accident or intent, the message was clear. He would not play the court's games. He would not hide behind protocol. He would be seen, truly seen, and judged on his own terms. Some say that single gesture spared him a life of royal duty. He had revealed himself and quietly stepped away from a path others considered destiny. A year later, his mother passed away. Now an orphan, a husband, and heir to a vast fortune, the young Marquis stood at a crossroads, pulled between the weight of expectation and the whisper of something more. He found little meaning in silks and titles. What moved him were the stories of ancient republics, the philosophies of freedom, and the whispers, faint but growing, of revolution across the sea. Even before he had the words for it, he knew he would not live the life that others had written for him. His path would not lead to Versailles, but towards something far greater and far more dangerous. In 1776, across the Atlantic Ocean, the 13 American colonies had risen in rebellion against the mighty British Empire. The cause of liberty, raw, uncertain, and deeply contested, was now the beating heart of a revolution. For the world, it was a distant fire. For Gilbert du Motier, Marquis de Lafayette, it was a call. Despite his youth, just 19 years old, Lafayette was captivated by the ideals of the American struggle. He read of the Continental Congress, of brave militias facing imperial armies, and of a people daring to claim their own destiny. These were not merely headlines to him. They were echoes of the Enlightenment ideals that had stirred his soul for years. But to join the revolution meant defying his king, abandoning his post in the French army, and risking everything: his fortune, his title, his future. Still, Lafayette resolved to go. The path was not easy. The French government forbade him to leave, fearing war with Britain. They ordered his arrest. His ship was seized. But Lafayette was relentless. He purchased another vessel, La Victoire, and set sail in secret, leaving behind a pregnant Adrienne and a life of comfort, to pursue a cause far from his own homeland. After a storm-tossed voyage, he arrived in South Carolina in 1777 and made his way northward, determined to offer his services to the Continental Army. At first, the Americans were skeptical, another young aristocrat with no battlefield experience. But Lafayette's sincerity and willingness to serve without pay won them over. It was then that he met George Washington. From the moment they spoke, a powerful bond formed between the seasoned general and the idealistic French nobleman. Washington saw in Lafayette a reflection of his own hopes, and Lafayette saw in Washington the living embodiment of Republican virtue. Soon, Lafayette was commissioned as a major general. Though he held no direct command at first, he quickly proved himself in the crucible of battle. In September 1777, at the Battle of Brandywine, Lafayette rode into combat for the first time under fire. The British, under General Howe, had executed a flanking maneuver that caught the American forces by surprise. Amid the chaos, Lafayette galloped toward the fighting and took command of a faltering division. Despite having no experience commanding in such conditions, he rallied the troops and tried to hold the line. Musket fire crackled across the fields. Smoke and confusion enveloped the valley. Amid the retreat, a musket ball tore through Lafayette's leg. Bleeding and in pain, he refused evacuation. He ordered his horse forward, continuing to organize the defense until Washington himself arrived. Moved by his courage, Washington ordered that he be taken to safety. But by then, the young Frenchman had won the respect of his fellow soldiers. The Americans had seen his valor. He bled for their cause, and they would never forget it. Through the brutal winter at Valley Forge, Lafayette remained at Washington's side, helping to raise morale and secure vital support from France. He wrote letters home, urging French leaders to aid the Americans more decisively. His influence played no small role in bringing France formally into the war in 1778. But Lafayette's role was not just diplomatic, he was a soldier, a leader, and above all, a symbol. In the eyes of the American people, he became more than a foreign volunteer. He became one of them. In 1781, he commanded troops in Virginia, cleverly delaying British forces under Lord Charles Cornwallis, a seasoned British general known for his discipline, cunning, and harsh efficiency. Cornwallis had already led successful campaigns in the Carolinas and posed one of the greatest threats to the American cause. Ruthless and strategic, he sought to crush the rebellion in the South and split the colonies in two. Lafayette, despite being outnumbered, used quick maneuvers, ambushes, and strategic retreats to frustrate Cornwallis's advance. He avoided direct confrontation, drawing Cornwallis inland and buying precious time. His actions forced the British general to entrench his army at Yorktown, a move that would prove to be his undoing. When Washington and Rochambeau arrived with French and American forces, the trap was sprung. Cornwallis, now surrounded by land and sea, held out for weeks, but was ultimately forced to surrender on October 19, 1781. Lafayette stood not only as a witness to history, but as one of its architects. Cornwallis, once the terror of the southern colonies, had been brought to his knees. The war was not yet formally over, but Lafayette's part in it had reached its crescendo. He returned to France in triumph, hailed not just as a military hero, but as a bridge between two revolutions. And yet, deep inside, he knew the fight for freedom was far from over. But before we follow Lafayette deeper into the storm brewing in France, we must pause to remember a man whose name is far less known, but whose actions were no less heroic: James Armistead. Born into slavery in Virginia, James sought not just freedom for his country, but for himself. When the war reached its final stages, Lafayette enlisted his service, sending him deep behind British lines. There, Armistead posed as a runaway slave, gaining the trust of none other than General Cornwallis. What followed was one of the greatest acts of espionage in the war. Armistead fed false information to the British while secretly transmitting vital intelligence to Lafayette. His reports revealed enemy movements, supply lines, and the vulnerable position of Cornwallis's forces at Yorktown. With this knowledge, Lafayette and Washington were able to corner the British Army, a decisive maneuver that led to the surrender that ended the war. After the war, Lafayette championed Armistead's freedom, writing a personal letter to the Virginia legislature in his support. In gratitude, James Armistead added a name to his own: James Armistead Lafayette. The bond between the two men endured beyond the battlefield. Lafayette remained in contact with him, ensured his recognition, and never ceased to speak proudly of his service. He had risked everything and helped win a nation's independence. When Lafayette returned to France in 1782, he did not return to the same world he had left. Though still only in his mid-20s, he carried with him a reputation that far exceeded his years. He was hailed as a hero, not just by revolutionaries, but by aristocrats, philosophers, and even monarchists. A nobleman who had fought for liberty and come back victorious. But his fame also made the monarchy uneasy. Fearing his popularity and the revolutionary ideas he might carry home, King Louis XVI initially placed Lafayette under discreet house arrest. He was confined to his estate and forbidden from appearing at court, a quiet warning from the Ancien Regime to a man who had seen a new world. Eventually, the restrictions were lifted, and he was welcomed back into court circles with fascination. The king received him cordially, and Parisian society saw in him a blend of romantic adventurer and political visionary. Lafayette wore the uniform of a Continental Army general with pride, a uniform that had come to symbolize not just military success, but the spirit of a new age. But Lafayette did not waste time on fame. He turned immediately to diplomacy, determined to ensure that the alliance between France and the United States would not fade with peace. He met with American envoys, advised King Louis XVI, and engaged with thinkers like Jefferson and Franklin, who were still in Paris. He dreamed of a world where France could follow the American model, peacefully, rationally, justly. To this end, he joined the Society of the Friends of the Blacks, advocating for the abolition of slavery in the colonies. He lobbied for reforms in taxation, military hierarchy, and civil rights. He supported economic liberalization while defending the rights of the poor, a dangerous balance in a kingdom trembling on the edge of upheaval. He oversaw the construction of the model town of Romagna, implemented agricultural improvements on his lands, and studied the lives of ordinary people. He believed deeply that liberty must be grounded in real, everyday conditions, not just lofty ideals. Still, he remained politically isolated, too progressive for the court, yet too aristocratic for the growing revolutionary underground. He walked a narrow and treacherous path, hoping to serve as a bridge between two worlds increasingly at odds. He traveled across France, giving speeches on constitutional reform and the dangers of absolutism. He wrote passionately of a vision in which king and people could coexist in balance, the rights of man enshrined in law, not granted at royal whim. In 1787, he was appointed to the Assembly of Notables, a body summoned by the king to approve new taxes and financial reforms. There, Lafayette spoke boldly in favor of a national assembly and the publication of a Charter of Rights. His proposals were met with resistance and derision from more conservative nobles, but the people were listening. Soon after, the country spiraled toward crisis. Food shortages, skyrocketing bread prices, and crushing debt turned discontent into fury. In the cafes and streets of Paris, Lafayette's name was often spoken, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with suspicion. He was the American hero, yes, but could he be a French savior too? Yet all around him, tension was rising. The French people, burdened by debt, taxes, and inequality, were growing restless. And while the court still danced and debated, Lafayette understood what many of his peers did not, that the wind of revolution was blowing west to east. He kept close contact with his American friends and continued to support Republican causes. But he also believed in moderation, in reform, not destruction. His greatest hope was to guide France through a peaceful transformation. A constitutional monarchy, modeled on England's or the young United States, seemed to him the path forward. It was with this vision in mind that Lafayette prepared for the greatest challenge of his life. For though the American battlefield had made him a hero, it would be in the streets of Paris, under the shadow of the Bastille, that his ideals would be truly tested. Lafayette had seen the contradiction with his own eyes. A nation born in the name of liberty, yet shackled by the chains of slavery. Even as the cannons fell silent after Yorktown, he could not forget those who had remained unfree. The fight for independence was not complete. Not while men and women were still bought and sold. Lafayette believed deeply and unwaveringly that slavery was incompatible with the ideals he had crossed oceans to defend. In letters to Washington, Jefferson, and other founding fathers, he urged them to take a moral stand, to end slavery and extend the promise of freedom to all. He purchased land in the French colony of Cayenne, modern-day French Guiana, where he attempted to establish a model plantation that would prove enslaved labor was not necessary. There, he freed the enslaved people under his authority and paid them wages, an early and radical gesture toward abolition. Lafayette's vision for America was one of true equality. He urged the young republic not to repeat the injustices of the old world. And though his voice did not change the course of American policy in his lifetime, it remained a voice of moral clarity. When he returned to America decades later, in 1824, he met with free black citizens, abolitionists, and veterans of the Revolution. Many had never forgotten his stance, nor his efforts to live the ideals of liberty not just on the battlefield, but in principle. Lafayette understood that freedom unshared was freedom incomplete. The year was 1789. France stood on the edge of transformation or destruction. The Estates General had been called for the first time in 175 years. Bread riots echoed through the streets. The people were hungry, not only for food, but for justice. Lafayette, ever the moderate, had positioned himself in the middle of a growing storm. Elected to represent the nobility, he nevertheless aligned himself with the Third Estate, the commoners, and joined their National Assembly. He was one of the first nobles to do so. His commitment was clear. France must change, but it must not fall into chaos. On July 11th, Paris exploded in unrest. The people, fearing a royal crackdown, armed themselves. Barricades rose. Rumors spread. Then, on July 14th, the Bastille fell. A fortress of royal absolutism was torn stone by the hands of the people. The revolution had begun. In the wake of the uprising, Lafayette was appointed commander of the newly formed National Guard of Paris. His task? To keep order between an increasingly volatile crowd and a paranoid monarchy. His first great act as commander was to present a new symbol to the people. The tricolor cockade, blue and red, the colors of Paris, were joined by white, the color of the king. It was a call for unity, a hope for reconciliation. The crowd cheered, but beneath the cheers, tremors ran deep. Lafayette worked tirelessly to hold the center. He trained the National Guard, enforced law, and sought to mediate between court and citizenry. He walked the boulevards of Paris in uniform, hand extended to both aristocrat and artisan. In August, Lafayette played a key role in drafting one of the most important documents of the modern era, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Inspired by Enlightenment philosophy and the American Declaration of Independence, it proclaimed liberty, equality, and fraternity for all. But ideals alone could not calm a nation in revolt. In October, a mob of thousands, mostly women, marched on Versailles, dragging cannons through mud and rain. They demanded bread. They demanded justice. They demanded the king. Lafayette rode with them, walking a tightrope between military command and popular will. Inside the palace, he persuaded Louis XVI to return to Paris. It was a masterstroke, peaceful, strategic, symbolic, but it also made the king a prisoner of his own people. What followed remains one of the most iconic scenes of the early revolution. On the balcony of the royal palace, before a tense and angry crowd, Lafayette took the queen, Marie Antoinette, by the hand. In a gesture meant to calm the masses, he bowed and kissed her hand. The crowd fell briefly silent and then erupted in cheers. It was a moment of theater, of statesmanship, and perhaps the last time the monarchy would feel secure. Though praised by some, Lafayette soon became a target for all sides. Royalists saw him as a traitor. Radicals saw him as a moderate standing in the way of change. The National Guard, once seen as a hopeful force of order, was increasingly mistrusted. The breaking point came on July 17, 1791. After the king's failed attempt to flee the country, a massive protest erupted on the Champ de Mars in Paris, demanding the abdication of the monarchy. Lafayette, still commander of the National Guard, was ordered to disperse the crowd. What followed was tragedy. The Guard fired on the demonstrators. Dozens were killed. Amid the chaos, a shot was fired, not at the crowd, but at Lafayette himself. It missed, but the message was clear. He was no longer untouchable. To some, he had become the enemy. It became known as the Champ de Mars massacre, and Lafayette's name, once a symbol of unity, was now associated with bloodshed. His popularity plummeted. To radicals, he had become the sword of reaction. To the court, he was still a revolutionary. In the assembly, Lafayette continued to argue for balance. He opposed violence and the execution of political opponents. He believed France could be renewed, not burned to the ground. But the tide was turning. In the streets, new voices rose. The Jacobins, the sans-culottes. Their language was not of moderation, but of purity, of vengeance, of revolution without compromise. And then, the blade fell. In 1793, King Louis XVI was led to the scaffold. He mounted the platform with trembling dignity and was beheaded by guillotine before a silent crowd. 9 months later, Marie Antoinette met the same fate. The queen, once draped in silk, now wore the simple white shift of a prisoner. The guillotine did not stop there. It became the terrible emblem of the revolution's radical phase, devouring nobles, clergy, and even revolutionaries themselves. The reign of terror had begun. Lafayette had helped spark the fire. Now he struggled to contain its blaze. As France descended into chaos, Lafayette found himself increasingly isolated. His vision of a constitutional monarchy, of liberty without bloodshed, was crumbling beneath the weight of fanaticism. Branded a traitor by radicals and mistrusted by royalists, he made one final plea to preserve order. In August 1792, with the monarchy abolished and the streets filled with cries for vengeance, Lafayette attempted to rally moderate forces in the north. But the revolution no longer had room for moderation. a warrant was issued for his arrest. Knowing he could no longer remain in France, Lafayette fled toward the Austrian Netherlands, hoping to escape into exile. But fate had other plans. Crossing the border, he was captured, not by revolutionaries, but by monarchist enemies of the revolution. The Austrians, suspicious of Lafayette's Republican sympathies despite his noble birth, saw him not as a potential ally, but as a dangerous revolutionary. He was imprisoned without trial. For the next 5 years, he was held in a series of dank, freezing cells, first at Nivelles, then at Luxembourg, and finally at the fortress of Olmütz, deep within Habsburg territory. His health deteriorated. He was cut off from his family, his friends, and the world, but not forgotten. His wife, Adrienne, pleaded tirelessly for his release, eventually joining him in captivity, bringing comfort and strength to his darkest days. In America, news of Lafayette's imprisonment stirred anger and sorrow. George Washington himself expressed deep concern. Even Napoleon, rising swiftly through the ranks of the French military, saw advantage in releasing Lafayette. In 1797, under pressure from multiple sides, the Austrians finally let him go. He emerged from prison weakened, but unbroken. Lafayette returned to a France utterly transformed. The monarchy gone, the revolution devoured by its own fury, and a new power rising, that of Napoleon Bonaparte. The age of kings and ideals had passed. Now came the age of generals. And yet, through all the pain, Lafayette held firm to his beliefs: liberty, equality, justice. He had sacrificed everything for those words. And though France no longer listened, history would. In 1824, decades after he first fought for her freedom, Lafayette returned to the United States, no longer as a soldier, but as the last living general of the American Revolution. He came at the invitation of the president himself, James Monroe, who wished to honor the man who had helped forge the nation's liberty. His arrival sparked a wave of celebration. Crowds gathered at every port. Bells rang. Streets were renamed in his honor. Veterans wept. Children learned his name. He was hailed not just as a guest, but as a founding brother. And among those waiting to greet him was an old friend, James Armistead Lafayette. Their reunion was quiet but powerful. Two men, once bound by war, separated by centuries of injustice, embraced again. James, once enslaved, now a free man. Lafayette, once an idealist youth, now an aged survivor. They held each other in silence, tears in their eyes. History had brought them together. Humanity had kept them close. Lafayette's American tour lasted over a year. He visited all 24 states. He stood once more at Yorktown. And everywhere he went, people cheered. Not just for the hero of two worlds, but for the ideals he still represented. When he died in 1834, Lafayette was laid to rest beside his beloved Adrienne, in American soil, in the land whose freedom he had helped win. The soil of his grave was covered with earth brought from Bunker Hill, so that even in death, he would lie in the heart of the revolution he helped to forge. Lafayette's life was one of bold convictions and quiet resilience, a bridge between the old world and the new, between revolution and reason, between war and peace. He had fought for American independence before he was 20. He had stood before kings, crossed blades with tyrants, and endured the dungeons of Europe. And yet, in the end, what endured most was not the battles he fought, but the values he upheld. Long after his death, Lafayette's legacy continued to inspire. Cities across the United States bear his name. Monuments stand in his honor on both sides of the Atlantic. Schools, ships, parks, and public squares celebrate the memory of the Frenchman who became an American icon. In France, his name is etched among the heroes on the Arc de Triomphe. In America, he is remembered as America's favorite fighting Frenchman. But his legacy is deeper than marble or bronze. It is in the very language of freedom. He stood for liberty, not as a privilege of the few, but as a right for all. He defended the dignity of the commoner, the enslaved, the forgotten. He refused to be silent in the face of tyranny, no matter what uniform it wore. After his death in 1834, tributes poured in from across the globe. The United States sent an official delegation. Flags were lowered, newspapers printed columns in mourning, and in a rare gesture, American soil, taken from Bunker Hill, was spread upon his grave in Paris, symbolically making him forever part of the country he helped to free. One of the most powerful moments in his later years came during his return to the United States in 1824. Addressing Congress, Lafayette delivered a speech filled with gratitude and hope, a moment that brought lawmakers to their feet. And then, he spoke words that would echo across generations. One day, America will save the world. It was not a prophecy of war, but of principle, a belief that the spirit of liberty, once ignited, could light the path for all of humanity. In modern times, his story still resonates. In classrooms, in speeches, in the conscience of nations striving toward justice, the name Lafayette remains a beacon, a reminder that ideals matter, that courage matters, that loyalty to humanity itself matters, and yet, his memory is not without complexity. In the 1980s, a statue of Lafayette that once stood proudly near the heart of Paris was quietly relocated to the city's outskirts. Some cited urban development. Others saw it as a reflection of France's still uneasy relationship with his controversial role during the Revolution. Too royalist for the radicals, too revolutionary for the monarchists. And today, centuries later, his memory is still alive. In books, in film, in monuments, and even in games like Civilization VII, where players can once again call upon his vision, his courage, and his unwavering commitment to freedom. In the game, Lafayette appears as a unique leader option, representing Enlightenment ideals and revolutionary strategy. His abilities reward diplomatic leadership and cultural influence, allowing players to shape a world not through conquest, but through conviction. It's a fitting tribute, not just to the soldier he was, but to the statesman he became. Because Lafayette was not just a man of his time, he was a man for all time. Dear traveler through time, if Lafayette's journey has moved you, I invite you to help keep his legacy alive. Leave a comment below. Share your thoughts, your questions, your reflections. Tell us where you think Lafayette's story still lives today. In your country, your city, your values. Subscribe to Timeless Tales and ring the bell to stay informed as we journey through the turning points of history. Support our work by becoming a member or sharing this video with someone who needs to hear it. Because history belongs to all of us, and together, we keep it alive. Until next time, I remain your loyal guide through the corridors of time. As Lafayette once said, humanity has won a battle. Freedom now has a country.